Andy, Barney, Opie, Goober, Floyd the Barber. That's some of the names from The Andy Griffith Show. Drop by Two Chairs No Waiting, the Andy Griffith Show fan podcast, and we'll visit with some of those folks, along with tribute artists and fans and just all kinds of things related to The Andy Griffith Show. I'm your host, Alan Newsom, and you can find the show, Two Chairs No Waiting, at twochairsnowaiting.com or on iTunes.
Howdy, partners. You're listening to Conversations with Jacob, hosted by my good friend, Jacob Waller. Make sure to check out the podcast where podcasts are available and check out the video version on YouTube. You can follow us on social media. Facebook is Conversations with Jacob. Twitter is at CWJ Podcast. And you can visit our website, conversationswithjacobpodcast.weebly.com. Hey, you got a show idea? Maybe a guest suggestion? Email us at conversationswithjacob@gmail.com. Now, here's your host, Jacob Waller.
And what's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Conversations with Jacob. Today is episode number 64, and I gotta say, today it's a windy day here in Martinsville, Virginia. Yesterday it was rain, and now today it's just windy, you know. But anyways, on today's episode, we got a good guest lined up for you. But before we get to our guest this week, which I want to make a few announcements. You can check out the website, as mentioned in the intro, upcoming shows, past guests, which I'm also working on something special for the website. I don't want to confirm nothing because it may not happen. Check out Two Chairs No Waiting. It's an Andy Griffith fan podcast hosted by my good friend, Mr. Adam Newsom, twochairsnowaiting.com, or you can watch it on YouTube. Also, if you like cars, cool cars, old cars, any kind of cars, check out the Rocky Mountain Cruise In 2024. The next cruise in, as of this recording, is June 1st, 2024. And if you missed that one, you could check it out on July 6th of 2024. And joining me today is Jonathan Farley. He graduated from Harvard University, the second highest grade point average in his class. He also went on to get a degree in mathematics from Oxford University. So please welcome Mr. Jonathan Farley. Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, for people who don't know the story of what happened to your mother, I'm gonna give you the floor to tell the story. So the floor is yours whenever you're ready to tell the story.
Yes, on January 31st, 2023, two of my brothers, Anthony Farley, who's a professor at Albany Law School, and Christopher Farley, who's a journalist working for PBS, they descended on my mother's house, which my mother and I always regarded as our house, with a bunch of police officers, along with a woman named Mary Ho. They didn't identify themselves, the police officers didn't. I didn't know why they were there, but I had a suspicion. You see, about 12 days before that, or maybe a little sooner, my brother Chris had forced my mother to accept in her home a woman named Mary Ho, H-O. My mother didn't want to live with this person. It was my mother's house, not my brother's. He had no authority, legal or otherwise, to force my mother to accept someone in her home. And in fact, my mother called me just a few days after Mary Ho had been foisted on her, saying that Mary Ho was treating her like an idiot dog. That's a quote from my mother. So I came to check things out. About a week later, I had been with my mother up until maybe the day before my brother put Mary Ho in the house without informing us. And it was even worse than I thought. Mary Ho had taken over about half of our house. My mother had been moved from her bedroom to another room, which still had more of Mary Ho's stuff in it. Mary Ho had about 50 boxes in our garage, 50. And but my brother Chris drove up from where he lives in New Rochelle, New York, 400 miles away, with his son Dylan, who was about 20 years old, 6'5", 220 pounds. and it was clear they were trying to prevent me from helping my mother free herself from Mary Ho. But the next day, they all left. Chris Farley, his son Dylan, Mary Ho. Mary Ho's stuff is still in the house, but they had all left. My mother called Mary Ho the next day to tell her, don't come back except to remove your stuff, please. Instead, 2 days after that, that's when this police raid occurred. My brother Chris, my brother Anthony, who had seen my mother 3 times in 5 years, Mary Ho, and a bunch of police officers came. And I thought they were there to force us to keep Mary Ho in our house because I didn't know what the laws were regarding tenants. In fact, my mother had every right to tell Mary Ho to go. Mary Ho had been there 8 days or less. In New York, you have to be somewhere 14 days before you have some legal rights to stay. But instead, my mother was taken. So on the police body camera footage, which you can see at the website inafarleyjan31.com, I'm asking the police, what are our legal rights? Does my mother have to go with you? My mother is saying, I want to see a lawyer. My mother is saying, I do not want to leave my property, and yet they took her. You can also see on this police body camera footage, my brother Anthony telling my mother, no one's trying to take your house, because my mother asked him that question on the police body camera footage. But on that same police body camera footage, you can see Mary Ho telling the policeman, she is going to take my mother's house. That the plan is for my mother to be removed forever from her home that day. And then she, Mary Ho, will change the locks on me so I can't come back. And then she, Mary Ho, will be left alone in the house, in control of the house. That's completely illegal. For starters, as I said, my brother Chris Farley had no legal authority to be selling my mother's house or giving my mother's house to any other person. He didn't live there either. Hadn't for about 30 or 40 years. I don't know how long. And then on top of that, you have this illegal eviction. Now, the worst of it is not the eviction, but at the very least, it's a kind of eviction with no notice, no notification, and they're going to change locks, which even landlords are not allowed to do. And she wasn't the landlord. My mother was the sole homeowner. She and my late father were the only people whose names were on the deed for the house. And I consulted lawyers after this, and they confirmed none of this was legal, and yet it happened. But that wasn't the worst of it. I called up police to find out where my mother was. They told me she wasn't missing, she wasn't kidnapped, and they wouldn't tell me where they were. And Sergeant Mazenga of the Monroe County Sheriff's deputies wouldn't tell me why he wouldn't tell me where my mother was. Like, what's the legality of that? Is this Argentina 50 years ago where you can just disappear people? Is this a Soviet gulag? You mean an adult woman can be taken and hidden in America, and yet that's exactly what happened. Now, in case you're wondering, was my mother mentally ill or something like that? She had memory problems. She typically could not remember what happened one day before, but she could reason, she could have discussions, she could make decisions. I talked to her every day for years before she was kidnapped by my brothers and the police and Mary Ho. And often I talked about complex issues, my personal life, current events. So she could do all of that. And you can actually see her having these discussions with the police on the police body camera footage. And that, I have to say, was when she was at a low state of cognition. Because before Mary Ho had moved into our house, compared to that, my mother's state of cognition was really low as I'd seen it, except for 2 times when we thought she had low blood sugar. My mother actually speculated that Mary Ho had been drugging her. And I do know that Mary Ho had drugged her with at least one drug, melatonin. People think it's an innocuous sleep medicine, but it wasn't one of the drugs that my mother's doctor gave her. And moreover, sleep aids like melatonin increased the risk of dementia and memory loss by 79%. So I have a theory that my brother was secretly giving her melatonin. My brother's not a medical doctor, in order to create the problem that didn't exist, so he could justify saying she is mentally incompetent and take her. But as it happens, there had been no declaration of mental incompetence. There had been no doctor's evaluation. She was just taken. And I knew where she was supposed to be a few days later, because on February 5, 2023, she was scheduled to see a family friend named Martha Clasquin, who I regard now as a traitor, quite frankly, but at a church concert, not her church, but a church in our town of Brockport, New York, which is near Rochester. So I went to that concert to see if my mother might be there, and she was there. I went up to her and told her she was with Mary Ho and Martha Clasquin, and I told my mother, this woman had helped kidnap you 5 days before, and my mother immediately said, let's go. Martha Clasquin tried to grab onto my mother and not let her stand up, and Mary Ho wouldn't move out of the way, so my mother just barreled past her, but Mary Ho called 911. I suggested to my mother we could either drive around or go back home. My mother said, let's go back home. So we drove back home, and then the police came. Sheriff's deputies from Monroe County, New York State, Brockport Village Police, and they were at our door. They had no legal authority to be there once they ascertained that there was no emergency, which there was not. It was a woman returning to her home, and she said so. She said in the police video, she wants to be in her home with her son, Jonathan, me, under my care and guidance, she said. And then the police did not go. They did not leave. So at that point, it is all illegal. The homeowner is telling them everything is fine. They can see everything is fine. But we now know from police body camera footage that my brother Chris lied to police. We have his recorded voice telling police that I was going to murder my mother within a few seconds. Now, this is an insane allegation, but we have it on video, and you can watch it or listen to it at inafarleytaken.com, specifically the fourth video. He is telling a Deputy Wakefield that I am a danger to my mother, a threat to my mother's health, that if they don't get my mother out within seconds, she could die, that I'm not in my right mind, that everybody agrees. There's no question about it, he says. Everyone agrees. And so this is obviously what led the police to continue their illegal acts. So, but we still have the police, including Sergeant Mazenga of the Monroe County Sheriff's Department, saying on police body camera footage, there's no urgency. So there he has it. For police to justify being there, there has to be an emergency. And he himself, this policeman, is saying there's no urgency. Well, they stay. My brother tells them that I'm taking my mother hostage. Sergeant, just imagine the absurdity of this, that the woman they had kidnapped 5 days before, because she's on police body camera video saying she does not want to leave her property, but she did not come back. They're saying that her being in her home is keeping her hostage. Meanwhile, in the police body camera footage, I'm way in the background. My mother's at the door talking with them. I'm a pretty bad hostage taker if I can be way behind her and she's at the door, and yet nothing, she's staying inside the house. But more than that, my mother is asking them, why are you here? And they can't provide any good answer, of course. But after about an hour, they come up with this strategy. They pretend that my mother needs to take some medicine, some pills, and that those pills aren't in the house, they claim. Well, what are those pills? They admit that the pills are the same pills my mother had been taking. For blood pressure, they state that explicitly. For diabetes, they state that explicitly. And then she also takes pills for her memory, and then she takes vitamins like vitamin C, vitamin B12, cranberry, stuff like that. None of those pills are pills that you will die if you'll die if you don't take them within hours, much or even days. But moreover, I told the police, and it's on the police body camera footage, that those pills were in the house. And you can see in the police body camera footage that those pills, at least some pills, are on our kitchen table. This is from January 31st. You can see it. So the pills were in the house. We told the police the pills were in the house. They're not pills that, are such that she would die if she didn't take them within hours. The pharmacy was open anyway, before they arrived. And yet they used this excuse to drag my mother out around 5:30 p.m. that night, 2.5 hours after they had arrived, tying her hands and feet, an 84-year-old woman screaming, "You're breaking my arm." And they tied her up like a hog and then carted her out tied to a gurney, all of which is illegal. Now, she wasn't in a nursing home, but if she had been in a nursing home, to tie up a nursing home patient is illegal in New York State. They tied her up to take her to one, or at least they said to take her to a hospital. But ultimately, she wound up in a place called Cranberry Landing. I didn't know this for 1 month. Again, the Soviet Gulag, they kept her location hidden. They kept her location hidden for 1 month with no explanation as to why they were keeping her location hidden from me. But now we know. Chris Farley, the PBS journalist, wrote in his petition for guardianship in order to show cause to the judge, Christopher Ciaccio, that he wanted to keep my mother's location hidden so she could not change her power of attorney. You see, she had the legal right to change her power of attorney. She had not been declared mentally incompetent. She was not a ward of the state. She was a free person who had been tied up, who had committed no crime, who had not been declared mentally incompetent, and as I can say, was not mentally incompetent. No test for mental competency had been given to her, and she would have passed any such test had one been given to her. I demanded that a test be given to her for 10 months after the kidnapping, to no avail. I wish I could tell you where you could see these videos so you don't have to take my word for it, but yesterday, those videos were all taken down by YouTube. There was a YouTube channel called Free Ina Farley, and now all the videos are gone. No justification. There was a man who has the channel Leroy Truth Investigations. He had 2 videos up, and one of them has been taken down, and the other, he's had a privacy complaint against it. None of this is legal. You work on YouTube, so you know you can take public domain police body camera footage paid for by the taxpayer, available through Freedom of Information requests. If they've been edited, I would guess that makes them the other person who edited them has the copyright then. But regardless, it's still the police body camera footage. And then you can comment on footage, and yet all of the videos were taken down. So this is incredible. A man named Terrence Donnellan, who was nominated for an Emmy twice, he made a video called Free Ina Farley. You can still see it on the website Vimeo. It's a 19-minute video. So that's all I can recommend to people, because I think that's all that remains right now, as of yesterday, on the internet about this kidnapping of my mother.
Now, do you think the reason that they're taking these videos down is because they're trying to hide it from the public, or they're trying to cover it, trying to cover the whole thing up?
Both. My brother or his allies obviously made these fraudulent privacy requests. Admittedly, some of the videos did mention Chris Farley's name, but many if most did not. One video was just of my mother and me in our house, with my mother saying she wants to stay in her house with her son, Jonathan. And it's police body camera footage. There's no possible way that Chris Farley or his allies could say this violates their privacy. And they can't make a claim on behalf of my mother because they don't have the control of my mother. A month after Chris kidnapped my mother, he was declared temporary guardian, but when he kidnapped her, he was not. He had no authority to do what he did. It was completely illegal. And his temporary guardianship was revoked. So on February 6th, he was no longer temporary guardian. These privacy complaints occurred either yesterday or the day before. So Chris has no authority to be speaking on behalf of Ina Farley, my mother, who did not obviously make the privacy complaints.
So, and this right here kind of shows that police would just believe they would just believe anybody without any proof.
Sorry?
So from this whole situation, the police would just believe anybody without any proof.
Yes, that's exactly what they did. They heard one party, Chris Farley, and just acted on his word. There was no investigation, no assumption that maybe there's another side, no assumption that maybe Chris Farley had an ulterior motive. And of course, they didn't even believe their own eyes, that here is a woman who is having a discussion with them. Like, why do you care? That's what my mother was telling them, about whether or not I take my diabetes medicine. Why do you care? What business is it of yours? What authority do you have to take me? My mother was telling them. She was making all these arguments. In the police report, or maybe it was the court evaluator's report, they describe it differently. They say that they talked to me for 2 hours. You see, they have to phrase it that way, because if they admit that they talked to my mother for 2 hours, then they would be admitting that they talked to a mentally competent woman who was in control. So they have to mislead by making it seem like, no, she was out of it. They weren't talking to her. They were talking to me. But they were talking to my mother for 2 hours. And my mother was making these perfectly reasonable, logical arguments.
Now, do you think this kind of thing happens like every day to other people?
I hope not. There are thousands of comments. Of course, now they've all disappeared. And most of the comments were people saying this is horrific. All these police should be arrested, which they should. And the ambulance workers who tied her up. And of course, my brother, Chris Farley, the PBS journalist, and Anthony Farley, the Albany Law School professor. They should all be arrested. I've been demanding that the district attorney for Monroe County charge someone with a crime. Her name is Sandra Dorley. And over a year later, she has not. I've written her 2 letters since December. No response. The second letter arrived Monday. And then strangely, these privacy requests showed up yesterday. But this is, no one likes it when you talk about conspiracies, but this is a widespread situation of some kind of cover-up. There's no question that a crime occurred. You can't take someone from her house unless there's an emergency who has not been declared mentally incompetent when no one else owns the house, only her. There's no question this was illegal. They assaulted her. They used force on her illegally. They tied her up, false imprisonment, another crime. And yet, no one has been charged, and no explanation has been given to me for why no one has been charged by the district attorney. What is going on here? So I still demand or ask people to contact the district attorney from Monroe County. You can just Google district attorney Monroe County and find her email address and telephone number. But I don't have any faith now that will get anywhere because she has had 1 year. So I don't know what help to get. If anyone in your audience can suggest a lawyer so I can begin to sue someone, whether it's Monroe County government or the Monroe County Sheriff's Office or the Adult Protective Services Agency from Monroe County, because they were informed and obviously did not protect my mother. You should see how she wound up at the place where they put her. In one video and in a couple of photographs, you can see my mother with 2 huge bruises on both sides of her face, blood in her left eye, and she complains in the video of pain in her chin. This wasn't how she was left after she was dragged out, but after months being held against her will in this facility called Cranberry Landing, a memory care facility, that's how she was being taken care of. And the woman who made the video said that my mother had said she'd been beaten by an employee. And that wasn't the only complaint my mother had made over the course of the year she was held against her will at this facility called Cranberry Landing. My brother Chris even prevented her from making phone calls. He prevented her from receiving visitors of her choice. He prevented her from choosing her own attorney. Even criminal convicts in a prison have those rights. A criminal who's been convicted in prison can make phone calls, can choose his own attorney, can decide on who can visit him. My mother had none of those rights, and yet no one is complaining. No elder abuse agency did anything. This abuse continued for a year. She was given drugs without her consent. Drugs that had as a known side effect an increase in confusion. She's in a memory care facility, and they give her drugs that make her worse. All of this is allowed, violation of the Nuremberg Code. I fought for 1 year in the courts to free my mother unsuccessfully, and we were not allowed to even talk to her. We were not allowed to have our own doctors evaluate her. We were not allowed to see her medical records. We were not allowed to see her bank records. Why do I mention her bank records? My brother had complete control of her assets once he kidnapped her. He admitted in court filings or in documents that we subpoenaed that between February 2023 and July 2023, her assets had gone down in value by $150,000. No explanation was ever given for where that money went. If I remember correctly, his lawyer said that between July or June and December, he had billed my brother $80,000. So we can double that maybe and come up with an estimate for how much money my brother spent to keep my mother incarcerated. My mother had committed no crime. Perhaps $160,000. In what universe does that make any sense? That you spend $160,000 to keep your mother incarcerated against her will, and it was against her will. We have the video footage and we have reports from Cranberry Landing of my mother saying, "I'm a prisoner. I want to call the police. Release me. I've never been treated this way in my entire life since I've come to this country." She's from Jamaica. So we have the video and the documentary proof that it was against her will. And yet my brother's willing to spend $160,000 perhaps to keep her in this torture chamber. What sense does that make? It's not for her health. We can see the videos of my mother with the blood in her eye, the 2 bruises on both sides of her face, complaining about the pain in her chin. So he's not doing this for her health. Obviously, if he had been, he would have removed her from that facility as soon as he heard that she had blood in her eye, 2 gigantic bruises on both sides of her face, and pain in her chin. But he didn't. He kept her there. So the logical explanation, yes, go ahead.
Okay. Now, for the ones that are listening or watching this, they may question, and why did y'all let the police in to begin with, and why not talk to him at the door?
My mother is the one who is in charge. I told my mother, don't let the police in, but she makes the decisions. So she let them in. The first time they kidnapped her on January 31st, 2023, they did not say they were here to take her. So I assumed that they were, which is, I'm sure, it's definitely a violation of protocol, but probably a violation of the law. They had no papers, no documents, no warrant. They didn't even identify who they were. I didn't know if they were Monroe County Sheriff's deputies or Brockport Village Police. I had to find that out the next day or two. But even though my mother is on video saying, "I don't want to leave my property," the police told me, a woman, I think her name was Stephanie, told me that my brothers are just taking her out for a drive or maybe to dinner. Now, I guess police can legally lie to you. We now know that the police had as their original plan to remove my mother permanently from her house on that day. So the woman knew she was lying to me when she said that. However, that's what they said. So we did not know that you could be kidnapped like this. And in fact, you're not supposed to be able to be kidnapped like this. This is all illegal. Where is the American Civil Liberties Union? In New York, they call it the New York Civil Liberties Union. Where are the women's organizations? I wrote the local president of the National Organization of Women. Where's the NAACP? Where's the National Urban League? Black organizations, civil rights organizations. Where are they? A woman was taken from her home and not returned. She was kidnapped. Lawyers don't like it when I use that term, but that is the only correct term for a layperson. She was taken from her house the second time by force. She was taken to a place where we now have a record that she did not want to be and considered herself a prisoner. It's incontrovertible that there was no legal authority to do that. Certainly not for the first month until my brother became temporary guardian. And yet it was all allowed and is still being allowed because no one is being charged with a crime.
Now I've seen the video, and I think in the video which you said that if you do something about it, then they'll end up arresting you.
Yes, Sergeant Mazenga of the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. He was a supervisor of Zone C of the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. He had told me, and you can watch the police body camera footage, he had told me that if I even speak to my mother, he would arrest me. I'm not a lawyer. This sounds like a complete violation of the First Amendment. He's not saying that if I interfere with them, he'll arrest me. He's saying if I even speak to my mother, they'll arrest me.
Wow.
Outrageous. Yet he has not been fired. He has not been arrested.
Now, was also in the video, when they was talking to your mother, which I noticed in the background, had one of the officers kind of smirking a little bit.
Yes. So Leroy Truth Investigations makes a point of this. He says we should have that woman's job. I don't believe she was a police officer per se. I think she was one of the ambulance workers. And yes, they thought this was all amusing. This brutalization of an 84-year-old woman illegally by the police. All of them need to be not just fired, but arrested. Incidentally, I made a Freedom of Information request, and Monroe County's government told me they don't even know the names of the ambulance personnel. That's an obvious lie. In the video, you can also hear me demanding the body camera footage. They prevented me from getting it for about 8 months. And normally guardianship trials happen after 28 days. So they kept the footage from me long enough so that they thought that I would lose the guardianship trial. But as it happens, I fought legally long enough so that I had the footage, but we were still at a disadvantage in the guardianship case. Eventually, my brother was removed as temporary guardian, but he still is continuing his vicious fight. And I suspect that if you put this video up on YouTube, YouTube will tell you to take it down. So be prepared for that and fight back.
Yeah, probably so. Now, for people that's watching this, they're probably, kind of minds go, how the human mind goes all over the place. Do you think that this right here was kind of, I don't know, about race?
My mother shouts that they're doing this because I'm Black. I'd love for someone to show me 10 people that the Monroe County Sheriff's Office has done this to in the past 30 years. And that's the only way you could prove her wrong. But it certainly is elder abuse by Chris Farley, the PBS journalist, by Anthony Farley, Albany Law School professor, by Mary Ho, who had tried to steal my mother's house, and by the police. It's certainly elder abuse. They have a woman there who's 84, and because she's 84, they think anybody can show up and take her. If she were 35, they wouldn't say that you can just take a 35-year-old woman and lock her up against her will and drug her. They'd get life in prison for that.
Oh, yeah.
But because she's 84, they can do it. She was not mentally incompetent, and she had not been declared mentally incompetent. And those police are not psychiatrists. They're not psychologists. They're not any kind of medical doctor. They can't stand at someone's door and evaluate her. At best, they could say someone is a danger. Well, what is a danger though? Not remembering what happened the day before does not make you a danger.
And what? So nobody in this whole thing has not been charged or accused of nothing.
Correct. No one has been charged with a crime, and they all should be arrested. Not just Sergeant Mazenga, not just Deputy Wakefield, not just the so-called social worker Aubrey Beldouf. All of them should be arrested and charged with various crimes, from the whatever the legal term for kidnapping would be, to false imprisonment, to whatever the right term for assault and battery would be.
Yeah. Now, before we wrap up this podcast here, do you get any closing thoughts for the people that's tuning into this podcast?
Yes. Contact the Monroe County District Attorney, Sandra Dorley, and tell her by email, tell her by phone, tell her by fax to charge someone with a crime.
Yeah, absolutely. Jonathan, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast to talk about this, because I think that this story kind of needs to be heard.
Yes. And I hope you get the 1 million views. We had about 550,000 views collectively, maybe more, 600,000 if you count all the videos about my mother and related to this incident, that the videos that YouTube has removed now. So let's hope that you get it. And I hope that something actually is done finally.
And what I'll do with this video here on YouTube, which I'll put the link down to the link that you sent me, which I think it was last night, to the Vimeo video, which that will be down below in the description on YouTube, and for people that wants to watch it. So, Jonathan, once again, I want to thank you for coming on to talk about this, which I really enjoyed it, and hopefully somebody gets charged.
Yes, hopefully. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, yeah, of course. All right, that wraps up with this week of Conversations with Jacob. Tune in next week for another interview. Until then, God bless, and we'll see you guys in the next one.